Hey guys, it's Ryan, aka Deathrite Squid, and today we're going to be going over the spoilers that have come out for War of the Spark. We've got a bunch of them that were just released, and I'm going to be continuing this series over the coming weeks as more spoilers are revealed. So basically what we're going to be doing is looking at each card individually and giving it a Spark rating out of 5 as to whether it will see play in Standard. So the first card that we're looking today is actually a reprint. It is a Ajani's Pridemate, the 2-mana 2/2 that gets a counter for every time you gain a life. I don't think this card's going to see a lot of play. It currently is in Standard and it doesn't. Fringe decks play it here and there, but most of the time it's more of a casual card than a competitive one. So I'm going to give it a Spark rating of 2 out of 5. It'll see a little bit of play in Fringe decks, but really nothing to impact the meta very much. So the next card we're looking at is Ignite the Beacon. Now it's a 5-mana instant that searches your deck for 2 Planeswalker cards and puts them into your hand. For this card to really see play, the format would have to be very slow, as it's kind of a clunky way to draw 2 cards that are also 2 very specific cards that a lot of the time don't impact the board the turn they come into play. Because of that, I'm going to have to give this card a Spark rating of 1 out of 5. I think it kind of sucks and I don't think it's going to see any play. Ravnica at War. It's a 4-mana sorcery that exiles all multicolored permanents. Now, this sort of effect, it's extremely powerful. A sweeper that can clear not just creatures, but other problematic permanents can be very good. The problem is, Kaya's Wrath being so efficient at what it does, clearing away creatures, it tends to be what you want to, on turn 4, what you want to clear away. So I can't really see this card being good while Kaya's Wrath is still around. Again, it would need a very specific metagame where lots of aggressive, low-to-the-ground, multicolored permanents are getting put into play over the first couple of turns, and then maybe a card like this could see play. For now, I'm going to have to give it a 1 Spark rating out of 5. So Jace is a 4-mana 4 loyalty Planeswalker, and like a lot of the Planeswalkers in this set, he has a static ability and 2 loyalty abilities. So his static ability is, if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, you win the game instead. So this card is a throwback to Laboratory Maniac from Innistrad. It's the same effect, but on a Planeswalker instead of a creature. So whether it makes it harder to remove or easier to remove, depending on how decks are built, I could see Jace maybe taking a place in similar decks to Laboratory Maniac, but unfortunately that means he probably won't be seeing any play in Standard, but will end up in more casual formats and more powerful formats such as Commander. So as he stands, even with the tick up to draw a card and the tick down to draw 7 and win the game, you'd need a pretty well put together combo deck, as well as quite a bit of good luck, I think, to make this card work in Standard. Unfortunately, Jace, you are going to have a 1 Spark rating out of 5. So next up is No Escape. It is a 3-mana instant, 2 and a blue, for a counter spell that counters a creature or a Planeswalker spell. If the spell is countered, it does get exiled, and the controller of No Escape gets to scry 1. So we've got a few counter spells at 3 mana now in the format, and I don't really think a conditional one like this, even with the upside of exile and scry 1, is probably going to cut it in Standard. What it does do, though, is it does let very mana-intensive decks have a 3-mana counterspell that only requires 1 blue if they are looking for that sort of effect, and especially if the format becomes very heavily filled with Planeswalkers. I mean, we're getting 36 of them, they're at all different rarities, so I know a lot of them are probably going to be playable. A card like this could pick up if there is a deck that, wants to splash for a blue counterspell, or maybe even a mono-blue deck that could cast this. A hesitant rating, I'm going to give it 2... I'm going to give it 2 out of 5 Spark rating, but in draft, I think this card's actually going to be fantastic because it counters pretty much everything that people are going to be playing in that format. Okay, so our last blue card is Relentless Advance, and it is a 4-mana sorcery, and it says Amass 3. So Amass is a new keyword in War of the Spark that reads, put a number, in this case it is 3, +1/+1 counters on an army you control. If you don't control one, create a 0/0 black zombie army creature token first. So at its core, this is a 4-mana 3/3 zombie creature, but if you do run other Amass cards in your deck, you may be able to buff your zombies and make bigger and bigger ones as the game goes on. Now, in terms of standard playability, this card is definitely for the draft format. You're not playing a 4-mana 3/3 unless a mass is going to be one of those decks where I think it's going to be incidentally good, where you have a good spell effect that has a mass on it rather than playing an actual mass deck itself. For that, Relentless Advance gets a 1 Spark rating out of 5. Bolus's Citadel. So it is a 6-mana legendary artifact for 3 black, and it says you may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may play the top card of your library. If you cast a spell this way, pay life equal to its converted mana cost rather than paying its mana cost. It's also got an activated ability, tap, sacrifice 10 non-land permanents, each opponent loses 10 life. So there's a lot going on this card. It's extremely powerful, but it's extremely expensive. 6 mana, 3 of which are black. I mean, the deck you're putting this needs to be, you need to win when you play it, and that may be a little bit difficult in Standard. In older formats, this card gets absolutely insane with Aetherflux Reservoir, because whenever you cast a spell with Reservoir, you gain a life for each spell you've cast this turn. So you can sort of just go through the top of your deck, casting spells, gaining life, paying life until you start netting life to be able to use that, pay 50 on Aetherflux Reservoir and kill your opponents. Now, you can filter that with Sensei's Divining Top, and I mean, these 3 cards just by themselves make a pretty insane combo in older formats. Again, probably more towards something like Commander. In Standard, I mean, as a value engine, it's quite good, and you can do some pretty interesting things with cards like Banefire, where X is what you want to pay. So if your life total is higher than your opponent's and you have a Banefire on top, I mean, that's definitely one way that you can kill them. As for playability in Standard, it is extremely powerful, but again, it looks very restrictive in terms of its casting cost, and I don't really know a deck that it would go in right now. So if a new archetype emerges and can actually play this card, I'll be super excited to see it, but as it stands right now, I'm going to give it a tentative 2 out of 5. Because I just don't see where this card fits. Dread Horde Invasion. So this is a really interesting card. It reads 1 and a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life and amass 1. It's also got a second line of text. Whenever a zombie token you control attacks with power 6 or greater, it gains lifelink until end of turn. So the second line is obviously there for when you create a large zombie over a few turns, you can gain back the life you lost on amassing. But what it does really remind me of is Bitter Blossom, a card we've had previously that made a 1/1 flying fairy every turn. So where Bitter Blossom went wider, Dreadhorde Invasion goes bigger, basically. So rather than having a wide board of 1/1s, you get to have a bigger and bigger zombie every turn until that zombie is dealt with, and you sort of go from there. So I wonder whether this will fit into similar style decks, whether token decks in older formats will be interested in it. In Standard, I could see token decks, again, an Abzan, maybe an Abzan or a black-white token build really wanting a card like this, but it's also versatile enough that it could go in a variety of different decks. I'm going to give Dreadhorde Invasion a 4 spark rating, and I'm also going to give it a fancy new name of Bigger Blossom, because, I mean, that's exactly what it is, right? So next up is Herald of the Dread Horde. It is a 4 mana 3/2 zombie warrior, and it has, when it dies, amass 2. So this card, again, not a standard card like some of the other ones we've seen, but does look like a solid amass card for a draft deck. It's essentially just a 4 mana 3/2 that dies into a 2/2 that, can get bigger or buff one of your other creatures when it dies. Pretty solid card, but unlikely to see any standard play, and with that, it gets a 1 out of 5 spark rating. So onto our first mythic. It is Liliana, Dread Horde General, and she is a 6 mana, 6 loyalty Planeswalker. Now, the mythic Planeswalkers in this set are all going to follow a similar line, whereas they have a static ability and the traditional 3 abilities, whereas the rare ones only have 2 abilities in their static ability. So Liliana's static ability is whenever a creature you control dies, draw a card. Very powerful effect to have. If you play a Liliana and then initiate a combat, you can gain some sort of value just from that static, but her loyalty abilities also help you achieve that goal. So her +1, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Fantastic. I love a Planeswalker that protects itself when it comes down. Her -4, she does start at 6. That's a lot of loyalty to play with. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures, so you can use this to advantage in many ways. If you have small creatures or creatures you don't need anymore, you can sacrifice them to draw cards off her first ability, but your opponent will have to sacrifice something as well. Now, edict effects usually are not great because your opponent does get to choose, but here when you're making them sacrifice 2 things, I think it could be quite powerful because there's not a lot of go-wide decks out there that you'd want to play a card like this against, so if you are bringing it in or running a card like this, it'd be for the situations where it is good. And then her -9, each opponent chooses a permanent they control of each permanent type and sacrifices the rest. So this is a Cataclysm type effect. This card is pretty powerful. It is 6 mana, which is expensive, but Vraska Relic Seeker has seen some play in sideboards and as 1 or maybe 2 ofs in Sultai decks. I could see Liliana taking a similar spot in those sort of decks as well, so I'm going to go ahead and give her a 4 spark rating. I think this card is actually quite powerful for the mana cost, and if the format is slow enough, we're definitely going to see a couple of copies show up in lists. Obnixilus's Cruelty. It is 2 and a black for an instant. opponent, target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. If that creature would die this turn, exile instead. So 3 mana to pretty much kill a thing that's a decent rate. Now it would come up if there were indestructible creatures or something like that. A card like this could be good out of the sideboard, or maybe show up in main decks if there were problematic cards that people need to deal with. I think there are better options currently for removal in standard, but do keep in mind this card is common, so if you are drafting, pick up as many of these as you can, because they don't usually print removal this good this cheap anymore. Because of that, I don't think it's going to make an impact in standard. Maybe in sideboards if it does, so I'm going to have to give it a 2 spark rating, because there is a chance that it could show up if there were indestructible cards that need to be dealt with. Okay, so exciting stuff here. We have Obnixilis the Hate Twisted. He is a 5 mana, 5 loyalty, uncommon planeswalker. So the uncommons in this set, they have minus abilities and static abilities, and that is it. So they act in a really interesting way where you will tick down the loyalty ability, and unless you can proliferate or do something else similar to that, once you've ticked them down a couple of times, they kind of just become like an enchantment. So let's take a look at Obnix. So he has, whenever an opponent draws a card, he deals 1 damage to that player, and then he also has a 2 loyalty tick down, destroy target creature, its controller draws 2 cards. So it's an interesting ability. The drawback of your opponent drawing 2 cards is real. I can see a couple of situations where this could be good, maybe against a card like a Hydroid Krasis, for example. In a matchup where your opponent has one of them, and Obnixilis could put a bit of work in. He negates the life gained by the Krasis, and giving your opponent 2 cards when they have just drawn 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever may not matter too much, and it does also cleanly kill that Krasis when it comes down. So if you can get Obnixilis down, it makes it very hard for your opponent to want to cast a Krasis, because they don't gain the life that they normally get, and this thing will kill 2 things, like guaranteed, unless your opponent deals with it pretty quickly. It is very risky to give your opponent that number of cards. I'm gonna give it a 2 spark rating. I could see it coming out of the sideboard to deal with cards like that, and maybe deal with decks that are trying to draw a lot of cards and go off, but unless we see something like that, it probably won't see standard play. Okay, and on to our last black card for today. It is Vraska's Finisher, a 3 mana 3/2 Gorgon Assassin. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target creature or planeswalker your opponent controls that was dealt damage this turn. So this card is really there for draft, so you can chump attack through some creatures or add a planeswalker. If your opponent takes the block, you can then play the Finisher to kill the creature or kill the planeswalker if you did chip away at it. It's not powerful enough for standard play, and we'll be getting a 1 spark rating. Tibalt is back. He is an uncommon 3 mana, 5 loyalty planeswalker this time, and he has 2 abilities. The first is his passive, your opponents can't gain life, and his second, the tick down, -2, you create a 1/1 that pings something when it dies. So if Tibalt doesn't die, you get a pretty decent effect to have in a mono red aggressive deck, along with 2 1/1s that deal 1 damage on the way out. That's actually a pretty good deal. The biggest problem is that I don't think the red deck can fit that right now. Though, in the future, once rotation happens, this card could definitely see some play. I could also see it coming in out of the sideboard against decks that try to gain life against the mono red deck, but I think that might be a fringe case scenario. I'm going to give Tibalt a 2 spark rating, just because of that potential of being a sideboard card. Only 2 red cards today, and they both have Tibalt in the title. This one is Tibalt's Rager. It's 1 and a red for a 1/2 devil that, when it dies, it deals 1 damage, and you can pay 1 and a red to pump it +2/+0 till end of turn. There's a lot going on here, but I don't think it adds up to very much at all. Mono red doesn't really want this card. Green red doesn't really want this card. I don't even know if I'd draft this card. I'm going to give it a 1 spark rating, and we'll leave it with the old Tibalt. On to green, and our first card is Arlen's Wolf. It's a 3 mana 3/2, and it can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less. This card isn't for standard. It gets a 1 spark rating. We don't really need to talk about it. And the next green card is Arlen, Voice of the Pack. It is a 6 mana 7 loyalty planeswalker at uncommon. Its first ability, Wolves and Werewolves enter the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter, and she ticks down to make a 2/2 wolf. So pretty good synergy within herself. In draft, I can see it being a pretty good form of card advantage, but outside of there, it's just too expensive. For standard, you'd like to play Wolves to get the buff, but the problem is she doesn't come down until turn 6. For standard playability, Arlen, you get a 1 spark rating. Okay, so the last green card is Paradise Druid. It is a 2/1 for 1 and a green that taps for 1 mana of any color and has hexproof when when it is untapped. So pretty cool card. Unfortunately, the stat line's a little bit weaker than what we've seen before. Reminds me a bit of Sylvan Caryatid, a card from Theros that put a lot of work in there, but that was mainly due to the 0-3 stat line. I think the 2-1 on this card leaves it a little too vulnerable for AoE effects like Chain Whirlers. It doesn't block, which is something Sylvan Caryatid could do, so making that hexproof a little bit worse. Unfortunately, I think we just have too many good mana options on creatures at the moment with Llanowar Elf, an Incubation Druid, Druid of the Cowl. There's so many of these cards out there at the moment that I just don't think there's a place for Paradise Druid in Standard at the moment. Maybe once we rotate, it could see a little bit of play, but for now, it gets a 1 spark rating. Moving on to multicolored, we have Ajani the Great-Hearted, 4 mana, 5 loyalty planeswalker at rare. His passive reads creatures you control have vigilance. His +1, you gain 3 life, and his -2, put a counter on each creature you control and a counter on each other planeswalker you control. So this is a very powerful effect, and this card will slot straight into the green-white tokens deck in Standard. That passive ability giving all your creatures vigilance means that Convoke becomes a lot easier after attacks, and that tick down enables those attacks that you want to get through. It's an absolutely fantastic card that will definitely see play in that deck in Standard, and for that it gets a 5 spark rating. Alright, next up is Invade the City. 1 blue-red for a sorcery. Amass X, where X is the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. So this card's kind of interesting. It can make a really big creature in the right deck, such as say a Drake's deck or even like the Is It Phoenix deck. Both of those decks already play heavily into instant and sorceries, and this card could slot right into them. The big problem is that this card doesn't do anything else, and it's not really an effect that those decks are going to want, especially in a Chupacabra world where your creatures kind of need to do something when they come into play. Just making a 9/9 or a 10/10 that dies to all the removal in the format, probably not a great card. For that, I'm going to have to give it a 1 spark rating, but if an Amass deck does emerge, this could be a player in that deck. Time Wipe is next. It is 2 white blue for a sorcery at rare. Return a creature you control to its owner's hand and destroy all creatures. It's pretty simple, but unfortunately I think in a world of Kaya's Wraths, you're not going to really want an effect like this at 5 mana when you can have one at 4. Maybe if there's a non-Esper deck out there that wants access to a board wipe, they could use this, but even then there still are better options. Perhaps in a Jeskai deck then they could bounce their Niv Mizzet and destroy everything else, but again, I don't really see that as a card that a deck like that wants. Until we have rotation, I believe this is probably going to be a 1 spark card. Vraska Swarm's Eminence, 4 mana, 5 loyalty, uncommon planeswalker. The passive ability, whenever a creature deals damage to a planeswalker or player, you put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, and then her tick down generates a 1/1 black assassin creature token with Death Touch, and whenever it deals damage to a planeswalker, you destroy the planeswalker. So very fringe card. Looks like it might be more for draft than anything else, where I imagine there probably will be more random planeswalkers laying about. In Constructed, unfortunately right now, if you like Vraska, you're probably not going to be able to play with this one, but that's probably okay because we have some pretty good options for Vraskas at the moment in Relic Seeker and Golgari Queen. So for now, Swarm's Eminence, you get a 1 spark rating. And finally, for multicolored cards, we have Widespread Brutality. 1 black, red for a sorcery, amass 2, and then the creature that you create deals damage equal to its power to all non-army creatures. So this is a pretty powerful effect to have. At worst case scenario, make a 2/2, deal 2 to everything, that's not too bad, but if you have a 1/1 or a 2/2 army creature laying around and now you're dealing 3 or 4 damage to everything, that's actually kind of good. This is the sort of card that I would definitely keep my eye on, where it has an effect that you're after, but incidentally also has a mass, and so you can create these tokens where they can act as your win condition, but also are part of spells that you'd run anyway. It's the sort of thing where if we had maybe 1 or 2 other cards that also had a mass, but also had effects you wanted, we could see them making a splash in a deck that wasn't a complete focused Amass deck. In saying that, if there is a focused Amass deck, this would definitely be in it, or at least a sideboard card. So until we see more, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm going to put it at a 2 spark rating because I think the effect is powerful enough that we could see this card getting played. Only 2 cards left to go. They are both lands. The first one is Emergent Zone. So you can tap it for colorless mana, you can pay 1, tap and sack it to give your spells flash this turn. So note that it does say spells and not just sorceries, so that means you can play planeswalkers and enchantments and creatures even, whatever you're after on your opponent's turn. It's always worth keeping an eye on cards like this because they do create some sort of combo potential. In terms of more fairer decks, I mean, we did see people casting Quickens so that they could Supreme Verdict during their opponent's combat step. I don't think we're going to see Kaya's Wrath doing the same thing purely because the mana is awful to be able to do that. Running a colorless land in your white, black board wipe deck seems a little bit ambitious. So on that note, I'm probably going to have to give it a 1 spark rating, but it is always good to remember that cards like this are in the format, especially moving forward. Last spoiler for this video, and it is Interplanar Beacon. So this land, whenever you cast a Planeswalker spell, you gain a life. It taps for colorless mana, and you can pay 1 and tap it to filter mana into 2 different colors for Planeswalker spells. We'd really need to see what Planeswalkers come out and whether they're going to be decks that want to run a lot of them before we can tell if this card is going to be good. I think if there is a Super Friend style deck, you'd definitely run a couple of copies of this card. The incidental life gain is nice in a slower deck like that, and being able to cast those spells when you need to is very, very good. And outside of standard, I think this is going to be an all-star in any Planeswalker deck, whether it be EDH or, you know, a fancy modern brew, whatever it is, this card is going to go in those sort of decks. As for standard, I'm going to give it I'm actually not going to give this one a spark rating. I think we're going to have to wait and see what Planeswalkers come out, and once all 36 have been spoiled, we'll move back to this card and we'll give it a rating there. So that does it for the first day of War of the Spark spoilers. There's been some pretty spicy stuff released, and I'm sure there's a lot more to come in the next few weeks. I am going to go through the whole set like this, so every couple of days keep an eye out for a video running through the revealed cards and giving them a spark rating as to whether or not I think they're going to see play in standard. Now, there was one more card that was released that isn't in the set, and that is Tezzeret, Master of the Bridge. This is the Buyer Box promo, 6 mana, 5 loyalty, strange abilities, but oh boy, that passive. Creatures and Planeswalker spells you cast have affinity for artifacts. So affinity for artifacts is one of the more busted mechanics that Wizards have come up with in the past. It makes your cards sometimes free. I don't know whether this means we're getting affinity in the set. I can't imagine it does. I think it's more just a fun throwback to a mechanic of the past. But I mean, anything can happen, right? I'm not going to give him a spark rating because I don't think this card is good enough to see standard play. But in saying that, if affinity does come back, this could be a card that would see play, and in which case it would probably get a 5 spark rating. Anyway guys, thanks for watching the video. Stay tuned over the next couple of weeks. We'll be releasing more of these, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff, and I'll see you guys in the next video.